Hi, I'm Dale Powell, and welcome to That Spirit of Christmas. Hey, I'm Dale Powell, and welcome to That Spirit of Christmas. I want to start out reading to you today. I'm going to read that Christmas classic, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, just the first paragraph. So here's how he wrote it. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Who signed it? Scrooge. And Scrooge's name was good upon exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now, Dickens goes on to tell us that this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the tale he's about to tell us. Scrooge was writing at a very difficult time in life. It was 1843 England, and the Industrial Revolution was beginning. In fact, it was probably very much in its heavy birth pains as far as times go. Um, and just as every time there are societal switches, things get a little difficult for people. Uh, there was a time when people made their living hunting and gathering, but they'd have to move. And when they started to move into an agricultural society, when people started staying in one place, people who were these nomadic type people, wanderers and gatherers, they had a hard time. And eventually, the hunters and the gatherers, they don't exist quite like they used to. They exist, and they always will to some extent. We will always need hunters and gatherers as far as that goes, just like we're always going to need agriculture. But we don't live in a time now when people grow their own food all the time. Most people don't have the ability or the space to grow their own food or raise their own food. So when people started moving out of an agricultural society into an industrial society, a lot of people saw that. Now, Dickens saw that, and he saw that these were a lot of good people who just basically couldn't make it in the Industrial Revolution. Uh, they might have been very successful farmers if they'd had that opportunity, but they didn't have that opportunity. Right now, there's a lot of people who are suffering because they can't make it in a digital world and things like that. And as AI gets bigger and bigger, it's going to continue to be a problem. So we see some of the same things that Dickens was seeing. And he wrote about this character that he created named Scrooge. And I want to read what he said about Scrooge. He called Scrooge a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, mostly because Scrooge had money and he was going to hold on to it. He was going to make sure that he got what he needed more, and he didn't really care what anyone else needed. Yes, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He was very impatient with people who couldn't make it in the world, people who weren't making things, weren't making their way in life. He was very blunt. He would say things like, when he was asked about taking care of the poor, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And when it suggested that maybe he should visit them to see what it's like, his attitude was, well, I'm taxed for them. Isn't that enough? Is it? Is that what we're supposed to do with our fellow man? Do we just ignore his plight? You know, for over 20 years now, I've done a one-man play called The Transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge, and I love that story because so many people, when they hear the story of Scrooge, they always think, Scrooge, bah, humbug. But there's so much more to that story than that. In fact, When I did my one-man play, The Transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge, one thing I always like to point out when I have Scrooge say that, he comes on the stage and he says, "Well, every year, what is it I hear? Scrooge, bah, humbug." You folks did not read the rest of that story, did you? And it's true. We tend to forget the whole lesson of that story, and that is Scrooge changed. And that's the reason I like to do that. When he called him an old sinner, when Dickens called Scrooge an old sinner, it wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. It wasn't a commentary on his age, it was a commentary on his soul. His soul was old and broken. Here's some of the lines that I use. What Dickens is doing on page one is setting up the hardest case scenario. He's basically saying, let me show you someone who is far gone as a man can get. Because if that man can change, who can't? And, I think of all the stories where we hear this at Christmas time. Again, I go back to the Rankin Bass special from 1970, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, when Kris Kringle, Santa Claus, tells the Winter Warlock that changing from bad to good is really as simple as putting one foot in front of the other. And he tells him that is how you do it. You put one foot in front of the other, and soon you're walking across the floor. Put one foot in front of the other, soon you're walking out the door. I also had a few lines that I wanted to tell you about Scrooge and the way he looked at things. I find it ironic, and probably not ironic, Dickens knew what he was doing, that it's been 7 years since Marley died. Seven's that number of completion. We have 7 days in a week. Seven is used very often in literature as a number of completion. And it's been 7 years. So it's been a full cycle since Marley died. 7 years dead, seven Christmases passed, but Scrooge never painted his name out. He never said that Marley's dead. In fact, people didn't know if Scrooge was Scrooge or Scrooge was Marley. And this wasn't out of loyalty. Dickens is clear about that. Scrooge simply didn't care. He was a very uncaring, hateful man, and he had to learn one step at a time that it is important to take care and to care for our fellow men. But the emotional landscape is important because Scrooge is empty. He's a very empty character. And this is why the history of that story matters. He wrote A Christmas Carol in a bit of a burst. He wrote it in about 6 weeks' time. And he wanted to have quite a commentary on the way people treat the poor, the way people react to people in need. 7 years dead, seven Christmases passed. The point of our story is this. The whole purpose in Dickens writing this and him setting Scrooge up the way he did was to show us that if, what was it he said again? A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, if that person can become the person who knows how to keep Christmas better than anyone, may that truly be said of all of us. Merry Christmas.